it's okay to talk.
Again, our next presentation is Deputy Municipal Attorney Dee Ennis and Chair of the Board of Ethics, Dr. Terry Kelly.
Are we ready? Okay, you are going to be cheerfully ethical conclusion of this. I told Barbara I started this off on a PowerPoint on a black background with white, and ethics on black background did not go well at all. So we got to brighten this up a little bit. Okay. Terry, by the way, are you our current chair?
I am.
Has been on the ethics board for over 10 years, I believe. We've had the same sort of 5 people. It's just been a great group. So, and I'm their attorney. Okay. Okay. The ethics code is municipal law. It is not state law. As we've heard with Todd, they excluded themselves from many of the ethics codes. APOC is uniquely state. So all of you as elected officials, of course, have now learned about APOC. It is independent of MOA ethics. The MOA code applies to employees, board and commission members, and by the way, that includes school district employees and elected officials. That's you, the school board, and some service area board members who are elected. All these groups together in the code are collectively referred to as public servants. And by the way, for some of you new people, this whole code was just rewritten a year or 2 years ago. Ethics issues are brought to the attention of an ethics board, which is just simply a municipal board. It's 5 volunteers, pretty sophisticated long-term members. It can get to the board either by a request for advisory opinion or complaint. All those forms are on the clerk's website. I'll talk more about complaint in the future, but you used to have a strong sort of complaint aspect and investigations and this and that. Really, it's an advisory board, so we've really gotten away from that because all they ever did was give advice and very helpful, and it's not meant to pull people in and terrify them. We did that both to a department head and to a teacher, made them cry. We realized that the power of the presence of the ethics board was very daunting to people, and it's not meant to be, it's meant to be helpful. So we have taken a lot of that sort of draconian language out. It is staffed by myself, an administrative hearing officer who's also an attorney, and the clerk's office, so some pretty powerful staffing because it makes some important decisions. The administrative hearing officer, so if my advice to the mayor is at issue, we now have a second attorney that can review what advice I'm giving. The ethics board meets once a month. And because of that, if people are constantly calling me as also the municipal ethics officer, I'm giving advice on a regular basis. You can't run government once a month. So number one, feel free to call, but number two, so sometimes my advice is going to get reviewed as well in gray areas. Anything that seems particularly gray, I try to get to the ethics board. I encourage that. They're fairly timely, except this guy. Again, ethics board is advisory. Assembly people often drop in, and when I say that 2 days ahead of time they call me and I say, oh, there's an ethics board meeting, why don't you bring that issue? Amy Dembowski was of course married to a firefighter, so lots of potential conflicts. We gave her some guidelines. Mr. Dunbar was a member of a nonprofit board, Parks Foundation, which comes before the assembly for funding purposes, so where are those lines? And it's usually, of course, it's not a yes-no, it's exploring it and giving you some parameters. Let's see, what else? Oh, Mr. Trainee did an anti-marijuana resolution, which blew up some of the board members, telling the public how to vote. It also became an APOC issue, and that's because it was on the ballot. All of you can have all sorts of opinions and do resolutions and this and that, but obviously when it touches the ballot or an election, then there's all sorts of other issues that come up, mostly APOC. Eric Croft came before us. He was helping a constituent who was actually appearing before one of our boards in a semi-adjudicatory capacity. So we'll get into that a little bit later, but how much can you help a constituent and where do you need to stop? Why use the ethics board? One, they're pretty helpful, but two, it's also cover. If you bring an issue to the ethics board, generally you can rely on their opinion and nobody can come back after you later on. So it provides a provision where if you've done that, but it's also good effort. If you've done that, then people say, wait a minute, I went to the ethics board and this was their advice. And again, pretty easy to get there. They meet monthly, you call me up, I say, okay, maybe you should do a request for advisory opinion, or maybe you can just drop in. Prior to meetings, I've generally figured out who we need to have there. So if you have a particular issue, maybe I say, okay, let's pull this department head in, have some basic information. I don't do staff reports like you'll find they do in some boards and commissions, but at least be helpful and get some people there to help you out. You can always call me. Okay, we're going to turn more over to Dr. Terry here. But 4 key ethical issues. And do you want to start doing this?
Sure. I mean, so you can see the 4 key ethical issues are how we use municipal resources, gifts, conflicts of interest, and political activity. For uses of municipal resources, obviously there's the challenge on the one hand is you have to use municipal resources in the official capacity of your job. How much can you use municipal resources when you are outside that official capacity of your job, right? And as you can imagine, the answer by and large is not much, right? I mean, and so again, a general test in professional ethics is, imagine what you're doing on the front page of the news. Don't ask yourself, am I losing integrity here? Ask, what would a sort of, cranky, slightly disgruntled citizen think about what I'm doing right now, how I'm using this city resource, right? So by and large, you can see you can use, de minimis resources is permitted, right? So again, obviously you can, use the phone, right, if you need to call your kid's school to find out that, if he or she is sick or something like that, right? But the basic idea is that as you exit your official capacity, you by and large shouldn't be using municipal resources. As you can see, there's a variety of sort of recent ways. You got funds, facilities, property, your time, right? So remember, time theft, things like that can count as a resource too. There are some exceptions, right? I mean, and so a few years ago we had the firemen with the boots out on the street and things like that. Are they using municipal resources? Well, they were wearing their uniforms. They often had the fire engines out on the street, right? It was literally a real fire boot that was being used, right? And so is that use of municipal resource for a private interest, not a municipal interest, right?
And by the way, we made a rule that they couldn't do it on their work time. That was the other thing. So
That's
we're
right.
donating, hundreds and hundreds of our work hours for this cause as well.
Yeah, and so so the basic, and now in this particular case, we wound up crafting both an exception in the code, and I think the mayor laid out some regulations, right, that have to be followed. And so if you do have something like this situation, right, that you're thinking of using municipal resources for a charitable event, again, I mean, and you all probably know this, just because something is ethically good doesn't mean it's always ethically good to do it, right, or ethically appropriate to do it, right? So you may be involved in a charity, and the charity may be just like this one, right? Clearly a good thing. It's a community good. Is it municipal business? No. Right? It's not. Right now, again, in this particular case, we crafted out an exception. So if you are involved in, say, like a charity or something like that, there is a possibility that you'll be able to use municipal resources, but there are specific regulations and procedures that you'll have to go through to get that approved.
Mm-hmm. And I was just going to point out, we handed out both a PowerPoint and the code itself. And this particular section, if you want to look how to use this, is use of municipal resources. And it's, again, the code is incredibly well written. Is 1.15.040, and you can just skim over what is permitted. So there is occasional limited use of municipal resources, de minimis, of course, and also same access. That comes up, say if you're the fire department, you're the Girl Scouts, if one of the firefighters use that facility. Well, not unless it's offered to the public in general.
And the code that we provided to you has the 3-hole punches in it. So if you want to leave it afterwards, you can. And we're going to put those in your binders so that you can have them with your binders. If you want to take it, we'll make another copy and put it in your binders so that, and then you can put your notes and stickies in it.
So before we continue, I just want to note we've been joined by Eric Croft and then Becky Witt-Pearson. Becky, if you could introduce yourself to the new members and your role, and then Eric, if you could introduce yourself as well. And for the both of you, we also did favorite flavor of ice cream.
Oh my gosh. All right. So I'm Becky Witt-Pearson. I'm the municipal attorney. Those of you who are new may not have seen me yet. I've been out on maternity leave. I had my 3rd child 7.5 weeks ago. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about my role when Dean and I talk to you next. my favorite flavor of ice cream. Ooh, probably chocolate chip cookie dough, although that's a really hard choice because I am an equal opportunity ice cream eater.
Hi, Eric Croft, and yeah, I agree with Becky all, but Rocky Road.
As we move into the next section on gifts, I want to point out something that we changed about this particular code. The previous code was significantly longer and much more legalistic. You actually pretty much had to be a lawyer or a logic professor to understand what the various ways in which the code would move back on itself and had exceptions of exceptions of exceptions and things like that. So one of the things that we tried to do with this code was streamline it, which is the best practice nowadays in professional codes. We also tried to make it more principled, right? And so what you'll notice at the beginning of most sections of the code, there'll be a basic principle. That outlines the basic spirit of what you should be trying to follow. Again, the code is about, public trust ultimately, at the end of the day, right? Integrity of government and public trust. And so, again, I would urge you as you interpret the code or as you think about the code, not to read the code defensively, and I know none of you would intentionally do that. Actually, I know some of you, and well, maybe you. No, I mean I know some. I know, so I know the point of having an ethics code is not to impute that people lack integrity on the assembly, but again, social psychology tells us that there's a number of unconscious mechanisms that function, and when we're presented with a code that tells us a lot of things that we can't do, there is an instinct to be kind of Hobbesian about it and go, well, that which is not explicitly forbidden is permitted, right? And that's often true in law, right? I mean, but ethics codes are slightly different, right? I mean, so there are these principles. The principles are about supporting public trust, and so I would urge you, when you're thinking about the code, to try to, honor the spirit of the code. What are we shooting for? And so for the gifts one, right? I mean, so again, there's some legalistic exceptions, but what's the basic idea? Don't accept gifts if they're going to create bias or the appearance of bias, right? I mean, so bias, we'll see, right, with conflicts of interest in gifts, bias is a real problem. And again, not to impute anyone's integrity, right? But again, the psychological literature is kind of depressing on this, right? Self-serving bias is powerful and it's often unconscious. And at the same time, most of us overestimate our strength of character. Right, it's called overconfidence bias, right? So most of us have an overconfidence bias when it comes to how immune we can be, right? So, doctors were asked in one poll, do you think getting gifts from a pharmaceutical company affects the average doctor's prescribing habits? About 75% said, of course it does. You're getting gifts from a pharmaceutical company. Obviously that's going to influence you. Same doctors then asked, you accept gifts from a pharmaceutical company, does it affect your prescribing habits? Less than 10% said yes. Right? We're actually much better at seeing bias in other people than we are in ourselves. So as we go through this, none of this is to impute that anyone's a bad person or the board thinks that people lack integrity. But the one, unconscious bias, and then two, public perception, right? Now, there's a section in the beginning of the code that says you won't be held to the common law standard that an appearance of a conflict is going to be held as a conflict. But there are a lot of sections of the code where appearances really do matter, and this is one of them, right? So if you look at, what kind of gift can you accept and not accept? The big one is, if you go back to the principle, I'm sorry. Right, would cause a reasonable person to question the person's judgment in exercising official municipal duties, right? I mean, and so again, the standard is not looking in your heart of hearts, right? I mean, Sir Francis Bacon in the 1600s was put on trial for corruption because he was accepting bribes as Lord Chancellor of England. He was the Chief Judge of England. And he said, well, the bribes were against law, but they weren't unjust because in my heart of hearts, I always remained impartial. And in fact, to show you how impartial I was, I often demanded bribes from both sides. Right? Parliament didn't buy it, right? And neither will we, right? I mean, and so appearances matter, right? I mean, and so again, try to think of this, as they say, what if this was on the front page of the ADN? How would that cranky, disgruntled citizen, what would they think? Would it diminish their trust in government? The kind of legalistic stuff is that we do have a bunch of enumerated safe harbors, only because these examples have come up over and over and over and over and over again. And so we decided to, kind of like explicitly put these in the code.
And if I can jump in here, because I demanded these go in the code because they are safe harbors, and we needed some simple examples. It's in your code, by the way, it's 115050 gifts, and there's an enumerated list of them. We did with Cameron a whole bunch of the school district ones. We tried to accommodate what they needed. But there's a list of them. For instance, perishable item. You walk into a classroom, they want to give you food. Discount prize that's given to a large segment of the public employees. Homemade items. Occasional gift or meal worth $50 or less. Now, the ethics board actually did not like that, but the assembly put it back in. And of course, you still have to meet the general rule. If it's a building inspector, they should be getting a meal on the eve of their inspection. The next two, 7 and 8, are very helpful to you. Tickets including entry and meal to events held by a nonprofit organization, and then also tickets including entry and meal to civic events hosted by government agents, civic organizations, or community service groups consistent with your mission. And so you can now go to nonprofit organizations because they want you to come there, they want you to be part of it, you are part of the community. Under the other code, it was very treacherous whether you could accept a comp meal or something at a Wake's dinner or something. Try to really broaden that out. Same with our like police officers, or not the police officer, but like the police chief gets invited to all sorts of functions. They want him there, he's part of the community, and you'll find this again and again. And I think Forrest was one of the ones that really raised this issue with us, that hey, we need to have some ability to attend community meetings without running hoops of gift laws. There is another one for you. There's a whole section, I think, supplemental rules for elected officials, and one of them is that you may receive sponsor-provided registration fees, travel expenses, accommodation, and meals for an event related to official government business, education, or information gathering. But if the values of these received items exceeds $500 in total, you have to file a disclosure with the municipal clerk at least 3 days prior to going in. So you can have other groups comp you to go learn about things or to do official business. And if you have doubts, I mean, you can see that could easily get into gray areas. We'll come to the ethics board. But this one we haven't, because after the fact we were getting complaints. And I think it was the beginning of this administration, they had a plane that flew down to Oklahoma to look at housing options. We had all sorts of issues. Open meetings. There were like 2 assembly people and 2 of our administration. To me, it sounded like a trip to hell to go to Oklahoma in the summertime, but it was apparently a special benefit or privilege, and so we had all sorts of accusations of violations. And then this last one, traveling while campaigning or fundraising. This came up when I think in the Sullivan administration had a planned business trip, which of course the city pays for, and then added a fundraising element to it. Amy Dembowski was quite offended by this, so she put in this thing that says that if you do that, the pro rata share of travel expenses attributable to the time spent campaigning or fundraising for elected public office, you have to give back. In the old days, if you were already going on business and the tickets were already being paid by the MOA, and you just added that night of fundraising, you didn't have to add back. Now it's, if you add fundraising, look at these rules.
Okay. And actually, before we go on, I have a question for Pete.
Well, it's more of a comment, and for the new members, there is a certain segment of the population that believes we're all paid off all the time. And so don't be offended by that. That's just the way some people are. And, you have to have a little bit of thick skin to not let that bother you. And so you just sort of have to laugh that off. Just a little bit of friendly advice.
Thanks, Pete.
And just to emphasize what Dee was saying, where these safe harbors are not absolute safe harbors, right? The section begins, unless there are other factors that would violate the general principle. What's the general principle? Don't act in ways that would create the appearance of bias, right? So don't act in ways that a reasonable person would think that in your discharge of official duties, you're going to be biased. So yeah, you can accept tickets by nonprofit organizations unless you are, you've got a piece of code that you're going to be ruling on, right? For this organization, right? So they're not absolute safe harbors, but generally speaking, right, all things being equal, these things are usually okay. And again, in a gray area, this is a great place to come to the board, right? I mean, both to get advice, avoid scandal, because you're going to have citizens, who are going to complain about anything that even looks kind of fishy. You're protected legally by the code, by the board's advice. But again, we've had a number of, particularly elected officials, who wanted to come to us preemptively, really to kind of cut off scandal, right? So that if this does wind up in the ADN, it's a sure nice thing to say. I went to the Board of Ethics ahead of time. I had it thoroughly vetted and thoroughly cleared. So it really does help protect you, because you absolutely will have citizens, the real cranky citizens, who will complain vigorously about almost anything they see.
So I have a question from Austin.
Thank you, Felix. I was going to ask about the nonprofit piece. We get invited to events all the time, and not usually, but sometimes free of charge. There'll be a gala or a thing, and they'll say, "Oh, we'd like to have you as our guest." I think those are mostly nonprofits, but if it is a for-profit business that's doing good things in Anchorage, is that then not okay?
Well, if you look at this, there's two exceptions. One is nonprofit. And
Can you reference the page you're on?
Oh, sure.
So everybody...
Okay, this isn't out of the handout. This is the code.
Yeah.
So it's 1.15050, and it's 7 and 8. So 7 says events held by nonprofit. So the board said, hey, we're just going to assume that those are above board. But number 8 says hosted to civic events hosted by government agencies, civic organizations, or community service clubs, consistent with the mission of the public service work group. So I think that's much broader.
I'm having a hard time.
What page?
Oh, okay, I have a different copy than you do.
Okay.
26 and 27, I think is where I am. Is that right?
Just because it's easier.
But it's not quite the right number. But it lists all the gifts.
Sorry, can you
Oh,
say
maybe
that
I
again,
have
Dee? I
it
was
over
trying to find it. Can you just say what you said?
Oh, okay, so nonprofits are sure, but then this was intended to expand that exception to include community service clubs consistent with the public service work group.
Okay, thank you. If I could find it, then.
I have that. Yeah, we have that.
I know, I
Both
was
have it
reading
on.
this earlier.
1.15050.
Oh, that's way.
Under gift.
1 point what?
15050.
They're all 1.15,
In ours,
right?
it says Board of Ethics removal administrative support.
Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if you have the old code. If that's a
Yes,
copy.
thanks.
Yeah, maybe it's the old one.
This is June 17, 2016.
This is March 21st, 17.
Can I see what they're looking at?
We have 3 different versions.
Actually, then it says June 17, and
Carrie? Thanks.
well, it says amended March 21st, 2007. Oh, Bill got that figured out. Yeah, that's what it's kind of going 050, but she's talking about stuff.
No, this is the old
Definitely
code.
different.
Yeah, this is the old code.
Recycle.
So that's the old code.
Government agencies, civic organizations, and community service clubs. Page 3, okay. Yeah, but, this is, does anybody else want to look at that?
And the other thing, when Barbara makes more codes for you, or I guess you can look them online, is we have a nice, when this was first passed, a nice table of contents, and it's so much easier. I mean, it just says gifts, use of municipal resources. So very handy.
Yeah, and then also to answer your general question, obviously when we move from the nonprofit to the for-profit, things are potentially going to get more squirrely, right? So again, if it's something like, you've been invited to BP's Teacher of the Year kind of event, that seems okay, right? That seems like it's consistent with the city's purpose. Perhaps an Anchorage teacher is being honored, right? So that's kind of adding up pretty well, right? I mean, even in that case, unless of course BP has something coming up that's, coming down the pipeline that the assembly is going to have to act on. I think as you move further and further, let's say like a local developer or things like that, as you can start getting to people who do more and more direct business with the city, or have agendas coming up on the assembly docket, then it's starting to get more problematic. And again, I try to emphasize this is like the assessment, the test should not be your internal moral compass, right? I mean, because you might well be fully have integrity, right? I mean, it's what's the public perception going to be? And you don't have to go with the crazy cranky citizen. I go with the moderately cranky citizen, right? The citizen who's not like, What are they going to think when they see an assembly member or hear about an assembly member at the BP Teacher of the Year kind of thing? Oh, okay, right? How about a major developer in the city? He's got, oh, well, now they're going to start getting more cranky about it. So I think as you enter nonprofit, you're going to get into more gray areas, and that's, if it's not, and again, I would say if it's not obvious, like the BP Teacher of the Year, and they don't have some stuff coming up, coming to the board, or at least D, is good. Because again, we've had a lot of cases in the past, and so we can move by analogy usually pretty quickly and say, oh, in the past we had a case like that and it was okay, or in the past we had a case like that and it turned out to be a big problem.
Thank you.
Actually, another good example was, employees are slightly different, but GCI we have lots of contracts with GCI. They wanted to give end of the year sort of picnic party to all the project managers and all the employees that they work with. And unfortunately, that causes all sorts of problems because they're a contractor for us. So sometimes like really well-meaning things, we just have to say no because they have control of it, not they, I mean, we have control over the contract, the selection of that vendor. So those types of things shall definitely come to us, to me or to the ethics board.
Yeah, and I think I promised you I wouldn't lecture much, but this is a classic case where, in most cases, gifts are good, right? I mean, they're a good thing. And in Alaska, we have a lot of strong cultures that take gift giving really seriously. It's an important part of the culture. It's an honorable thing. But just because it's good in this kind of like general ethical way doesn't mean that as we move into a more structured governmental context, that accepting gifts under these certain circumstances is good. No one might be intending ill effect, but again, in this particular case, if the appearance to any reasonable citizen is going to be, wow, that looks pretty shady to me, then we don't want that. The loss of trust in government outweighs the good that would come from the gift.
Okay, now I'm moving very close. We're on the other side of gray issues in the ethics board. Next one, conflict of interest, and let me just start it off. Anchorage is a small place. You know everybody, especially you all, because you've been doing things, I'm sure, in the public sector for years and years. So we assume in the ethics code that people know each other. Also, you are placed not only here, but say in the boards and commissions because of those expertise. That the builders board has tons of builders on it. The bidding review board does. The P&Z, and so citizens will come and say, wait a minute, well that's not fair, you've got developers on that board. Well, they're particularly picked because they have both sides of the issue. So then we have to go to a second basic principle. I'll let you do that for 5 seconds.
Basically, the idea is similar to the gift one, right? I mean, like we don't want to be acting in situations in which we're going to be biased against the public good for our own good, or diminish the public trust, right? So notice the appearance stuff kind of comes back in again, right? So again, I would urge you, don't use your internal moral compass when making these assessments. Try to think from the perspective of the cranky citizen who's deciding how trustworthy government is or not. The issue ultimately about whether you're in this situation or not, that's the basic principle. You may not act when you're in this situation. Do you have a conflict of interest that precludes you from acting? That will be for you assembly members. That's up for the body, right? That is up to the assembly. It's not up to the ethics board. It's up to the assembly. That's specifically in the code. What is up to,
well, let's just, so your general rule is you shouldn't participate if you have a substantial interest, but of course the issue is what does that mean? So that's going to, here's a Dick Training question. Was a veteran thinking about sponsoring an ordinance that will create a small economic benefit for veterans? Was this a conflict of interest? And so here is how we answer some of that. Here are some of the, and by the way, we'll do this in a second too, is if you're employed by an organization and that organization has something coming before the assembly, that most certainly is a financial interest, and you'll see that in the definition coming up. And I've been watching the assembly, and that keeps coming up. Oh yeah, I'm employed by this group, but I don't think I really have an interest. And you really do have an interest, and it needs to be discussed. So I'm saying that right up front. But for instance, with some of these are sort of common sense. Is it a substantial part of a matter? Does the interest vary directly and substantially based on the outcome? Is it immediate? This comes up a lot in the developers. If a board is looking at a legislative code change and it's going to affect setbacks, that's generally legislative. But if you're a major developer and you have a project that's hanging on this issue, then maybe that you should be involved in that. But this is the one I think that the assembly most often can employ. Is the interest one generally possessed by the public or a large class of persons? Well, that would be the veterans thing. Well, of course it is. Or an Sullivan administration owning a restaurant. Well, when you have health codes that are going to come up that apply to restaurants, well, but that's a large public interest in that. And so that's one I think that you all should look at quite frequently. And then this will be a Terry one. Any other factors that would undermine the public trust? I don't know if you know any of those offhand. So who decides? Not you. You must disclose this. So, and people are being good about that. They say, well, I work for such and such, and this issue is my employer has taken a major stand on this issue or is benefited by that. Actually, Terry, this really is you. Why don't you do it?
Yeah, I mean, so the basic idea is that you may not act if you have a substantial interest in the matter. Whether you have a substantial interest in the matter is up to the assembly. What you have to do is disclose any interest that you have that could even possibly fall into the area of substantial. So where we have had a problem with the assembly in the past is that people on the record would say, well, I have an interest in this matter, and it's even a financial interest, but in my mind it's not substantial, so I'm not even going to tell you what it is, right? Or I'm not going to disclose it for review. And Bill Halsey, who was the legal counsel, and I was like, oh, that's not a good idea. You do have to disclose. The Board of Ethics can review your disclosure or not, and the quality of your disclosure. So a citizen can file an ethics complaint against you for not disclosing a financial interest, even if it turns out not to have been substantial, if it's one that should have been reviewed by the assembly. So anything that falls even in the possible realm of being a substantial interest, that should be disclosed. It should be disclosed for any official action, which includes deliberation, even sponsoring an ordinance or something like that. It should be disclosed before the official action in sufficient detail to allow the body to use those criteria. The body will then use the criteria to determine if it's substantial or not. If you've made an adequate disclosure and the body has said, that's not a substantial interest, you're good to go, then you're completely covered. No one can file a complaint against you, and it's ultimately up to the assembly whether you've got that conflict or not.
And remember when Amy used to ask 3 or 4 questions, I noticed Eric started doing that too. That really is important. It shouldn't be, hey, I work for this company, and then the chair says you have no conflict. So to develop those 3 or 4 questions to ask when that conflict issue comes up.
Thank you. I have a question for Meg.
What are and this might be more for the chair or the other assembly members, the nuts and bolts of that, how does that happen? So I get when, but how do we do that? Like at what point, so that we're making sure it's timely, that there's an opportunity for it to be heard at the right time?
Yeah, I don't know, Eric, if you want to talk about this, but usually, there's a few different ways we do it. Sometimes we do it right before we introduce something. That's in the 9F items, and you think, I have a substantial conflict here. I want to pull this and declare that conflict before I even take even if it's not a vote, on introducing something. That's one way to do it. If you do it during the regular course of when we get to the regular part of the agenda, that would be after the public testimony is closed and we're going to start actually deliberating it. Then you would declare your conflict, and then it would go through these questions. I think those are the 2 ways we do it.
So as early as possible, and so the trap is, typically things come before us on the consent agenda for introduction. So it's easy to say, well, I'll just wait until we're debating about it. The problem with that is you've technically voted on its introduction by doing that, by letting it go by. So asking the chair or some other member to pull it is even better, because then you haven't taken an action on it, and doing it at that time. And then, being as specific for all the reasons they said on what it is. Your disclosure is what you're going to get judged on. Then it's in the possession of the body about whether it's a conflict, but having adequate enough. And Amy used to, and now I or Felix do. How big a part of your business is this? What money do you get from it? Have you been involved in this matter? Those kinds of questions. Yeah, those things.
So Chris and then Becky.
I would add that if you do it as soon as you realize that it is a conflict, as early as possible, and as soon as you realize, because sometimes items come around that you may not understand on the front of it, that it does in fact come from your work. And Amy's practice used to be, she wouldn't even pull the item if she had a conflict. She would turn to me and ask me to pull an item because some would argue that pulling the item is taking an action on the item. And so I think just as careful as you can be.
Thanks, Chris. Becky?
Yeah, if I might, and Dee and Carrie can comment on this further as well, but the code actually defines the line as official action, and so you're not to take any official action on an item where you have a conflict of interest, and official action is defined to include all these things, any kind of debate, any kind of deliberation, and any kind of vote. So the important thing is, as everyone has called out, to make sure that you get the disclosure out there, again, as soon as you realize, but ideally before you've taken any kind of action, which again includes even debating or deliberating as part of the process, having that clarified right from the outset.
Thank you. Cameron?
Well, it's on a different topic, so if there's anything else on this one,
John, did you want to add on this one?
Well, yeah, I did. And it was something that came up when we did the flame retardant. One of the speakers came up and said John Weddleton has a conflict because we had addressed flame retardants on toys and electronics and so on. And, my store, we sell a small amount of toys and we sell used video games, which wouldn't have been covered by that. And I just had commented in work session. I went around my store and said, how do I even know if this, to kind of share that information. But it was interesting. Public perception, at least for her and probably others, was that Weddleton has this financial interest in this, and which was odd because I voted for it. It was probably pretty clear I was going to, but but I don't. Did I miss? Should I have disclosed that, or was that way overboard comment?
I think you're going to miss things that the public perceives, and then it's just how you handle it then. And I think it's something to address when that happens. I wanted to bring up, I noticed that we seem to have a rule that once you're declaring conflict, you leave the room. I have never known what the basis for that rule is, by the way.
No.
I don't see why you can't sit there, but, I just bring that up.
Dee, I think that may come from Robert's rules. I'm not positive about that. But the perception is that if there is debate or discussion about an item, for example, John's store only sells toys, and John is sitting like this glaring at you, that is why you leave the room, so that you don't have any influence over the debate. So that's what the practice has been, as I understand it.
Very powerful.
And then Suzanne, did you have more on this one?
A follow-up question, Felix, to Becky and Barbara, actually. There was an item that was pulled off and introduced by other members that I have a conflict with which I'll be disclosing on the meeting of the 23rd. And I would actually prefer to be out of the room during any public testimony for those reasons that Barbara has said, even though that I understand it doesn't fall under action, even though sometimes there is debate that happens, but because our corporate attorney has advised me to not be present for any discussion. So I know that's not action, but I could make a request, though, right, to leave the room for that.
I think we would agree with that maybe the disclosure should be made as soon as the chair reads, let's say 14A, it concerns the cell phones, and the chair should immediately go to you because the chair knows that you have made this disclosure, and you make the disclosure again, and then you leave the room. That's what I would recommend, but I think the experts here can confirm that.
Because it's a public process, so the public needs to hear your disclosure.
Can I?
Yeah.
There's been some, I guess not really disagreement, but maybe not settling on the right answer between whether you want to disclose as something's introduced versus when we're voting on it. So we have things that are introduced and we don't vote on them for 2 weeks. We don't discuss those matters. So what's the consensus of the group or from our experts?
That's what Becky was addressing.
Yeah,
is the introduction is an official
Oh,
action.
I'm sorry. Maybe that was when I went to the restroom.
No, and that's fine, and that's it, and that is the challenge. Is when I was actually on the ethics board in a previous life, and so was there when we, with Carrie, when we rewrote this portion of the code, and we went around on that as sort of when is the appropriate time, and we came up with this official action definition that it is any action really by the assembly on the item that's the creator of the conflict is official action. So you should recuse yourself, or at least disclose your conflict for a ruling by the chair or by the body before you get to the introduction point.
Thanks. Sorry for that.
Yeah. So Cameron, did you have a question?
No, that's not.
All right. So before we move on, I just want to acknowledge that the mayor and first lady have joined us. So welcome. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. I just wanted to point out that this is in the definitions section, and I think it would be helpful for people to quick read it. Financial interest includes the financial interest of any member of the person's household, and a financial interest in an organization if not only if you have an ownership, but if you are a director, officer, or employee. So that is defined as a financial interest that should be disclosed, or should be evaluated for whether it's substantial. And then also two additional definitions: the economic interest, anticipated benefit, and then private interest, I think, is important. It means an interest affecting belonging or occurring to an individual or private entity as distinct from the public interest at large. Again, we keep looking at that. We had an assembly person who signed a petition for naming a street or moving a street or something, and that became a private interest. She asked me, "Can I do that?" And I said, "Sure, you can do that." But then now you've taken a position, so now when it comes back up, you can no longer discuss it. Political activity. Political activity was really redone in this code. The old code, very, very difficult, and it really was more APOC related. We're not APOC. We tried to keep APOC out of our ethics code. The two things I think that were helpful is we defined political activity as an act for purpose of influencing election. That is consistent with APOC. Partisan, an act for supporting a party cause of action. And then your general rule, again, use of municipal resources for political or partisan activity is prohibited. And the counter of this, however, is that we put very strongly in the code that you all, the elected officials, you were elected to have opinions. So you can have opinions, you can say your opinions, but the question is how much municipal resources are you using to do that? So you couldn't take your 10,000 assembly budget and go plaster that all over the radio or in advertising, but it has to be limited costs, time, vehicle, and clerical in advancing your views. APOC's moved a long way on this. All of a sudden, they now allow legislatures to use their email and their websites and stuff to have opinions. But you were elected to have opinions, and we don't want to squelch that at all. But again, that's mostly an APOC world.
Gretchen.
Just an interesting question, even though it's not of monetary value. If someone asks you to be a host on a political event and they use your title, I mean, it's their money, but it's your title. Is the title?
There is an exact rule on title, and you may use your title, but you can't imply that you are representing the entire body.
Okay.
Okay. So, and it's good at political events to say that you are an assembly person, but you are not representing the assembly. We have different rules for employees, so there's a specific carve-out rule for you. So when you get the updated code, it's .110 as political activity.
Thank you.
But I guess that's the main takeaway point is that we have this broader prohibitions, that it's not just political activity in the sense of campaigning or trying to influence directly an election, but also partisan activity. By and large, citizens do not want to see municipal resources expended by public officials to advance particular ideological agendas, right? Even if it's not for an upcoming municipal election, right? So again, you're certainly free as elected officials to have opinions and to express those opinions. That's why you're here. That's why you've been elected. You cross the line when you begin using municipal resources to do that, right? Because taxpayers have the view, and we heard this directly from citizens, taxpayers and citizens, taxpayers don't feel that their taxes should be used by public officials to tell them what they should be thinking about the burning issues of the day.
Okay, and I think this is our final interest in municipal contracts or business with a municipality, quite often you'll have family members that are part of a company or something that is looking at acquiring it. It may be professional services contract. There are rules about that. The general rule is that you should not, you or a member of your immediate family or households may not acquire or be a party to contract, lease or contract unless you don't take any official action. In other words, you're not involved in the award, execution, or administration of that contract, and that you do a notice of intent to respond. Those are fairly technical rules, so do look at your code if that comes up, that you have a family member or a household person who's going to be awarded a contract or be involved with a contract.
Yeah, because the code will require that family person to submit this notice, right? So be aware of that. So it's not just you can say, well, I won't take official action and we'll be okay. The family member who is applying for this municipal contract, is going to have to submit that disclosure, and so you're going to have to let them know.
And I think that's it. Feel free to contact my office directly. When I can, I try to move you over to the ethics board. We do have a series of opinions. Most of them are outdated, but with the new code, I think there's some principles that are still viable. But again, this code is really meant to try to simplify and expedite your journey through municipal ethics.
One quick question.
Yes, very quick.
Okay, it may not be a quick answer, but maybe you could tell us where to look for it. I do have a question about when we use personal email in exclusion to our business email. Is there a place that refers to that? For instance, I personally think I would always use my business email for muni business, right? But it's real easy to fall into answering with your personal email. Is there some place in here that discusses that?
There's not an ethics code, but that's really a Todd question because it comes up in the public records request world. And when we had the AO37 debates going on, assembly people actually had to turn in their had to disclose that they had used their personal phones to opine about AO37, the labor issue, and Todd was squarely involved in that.
Just a brief answer on that, yeah, because that falls under public records, and more famously, cases of Sarah Palin and Hillary Clinton, where they're using private devices, private servers. Basically, if anything you do, whether it's a text message, an email, involves public business, it is a public record. So we strongly encourage you, as much as possible, always use your municipal account, not your private account. And the AO37 one, when the union made a public records request for all records, I guess the one sort of good news thing is nothing allows anybody to go and search your personal Hotmail account, for example. So it's an honesty-based system, but the whole thing is honesty-based because, a request goes out, people look, whether it's, we can have IT do a search of municipal accounts, for example, but, and I'm trying to think, I don't want assembly member, because what will happen sometimes, a constituent will email if you've got a special email account for your campaign or something like that, or maybe they use the personal one, what she would do is reply to them and to her official account and say, as we continue this dialogue, please use only my official email. But that way you automatically got it in the official one on that issue.
So if you do official business on your personal account, I thought that could be subpoenaed. Is that correct?
It could be subpoenaed, and it's subject to a public records request.
Okay.
And then, like in this AO37, I just sent it out to all the assembly members and said, if you have talked about this in your personal email account, please do a search. And several of them said, I never used my personal email account. Some that did said, here they all are. And then we went through them and kind of made a judgment call on, does this fit the records request or not?
Well, thank you for that.
So before we go on to further questions, just a quick comment on timing. I think we were really ambitious with our timing today. We do really need to end these next two presentations at 12 noon because Eric has a plan for the 12 noon discussion. So if we can try to keep our comments and our questions brief, please. Pete.
Thank you. When I was running for re-election a couple of years ago, I got some emails sent to me at my Muni account. People were asking about campaign events, and I just responded to them, don't send campaign-related emails to my Muni account. Please use whatever email, a private email or my campaign email for that. And so sometimes the members of the public will put you in a position where you feel like, wow, this is some sort of possible, violation. And so I believe that if you let them know immediately, don't do this anymore, you've done all you can do. Am I correct in that?
I think
Eve?
so, yes.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you for your time.
Questions? Thank you.